Where is this union between the ADL and U.S. law enforcement taking us? The answer is that the ADL wants America to catch up with Canada, which is dominated by anti-hate laws. The ADL wants American Christianity intimidated in the same way Canadian Christians are in British Columbia. Why is Christianity in Canada so vulnerable to anti-hate laws? To find out, we must take a closer look at the history and structure of Canada's group libel statutes.
Although Canadians, like Americans, have always treasured freedom, in 1971 the Canadian Parliament, with many members absent and by a slim majority, created Canada's anti-hate law. Section 319 of Canada's Human Rights Act states that it is now a crime to publicly incite hatred against an identifiable group. Section 319 limited identifiable groups by color, race, religion, or ethnic origin. Sexual orientation was not included. What does it mean to incite hatred against such groups? Section 319 stipulates that criticism of a group is criminal only if a person willfully promotes hatred. And who decides whether a person really intended to incite hatred? When the Canadian government outlawed hurtful speech, a new type of court system was created, whose purpose was to delve into the inner motives of the accused. In each province, a special human rights tribunal determines if words and actions are sufficiently malicious to warrant prosecution under Section 319. If they are, the accused can be found guilty, fined, and serve a prison term of up to 2 years. If, however, there is no conviction at the local level, provincial police confidently refer cases to the federal tribunal in Ottawa. I was told by BC Police that the federal tribunal probes much more deeply into questions of motivation and usually convicts. In addition, police in BC have recourse to an advanced provincial hate law more extreme than any in Canada. The BC Human Rights Act, passed in 1993, forbids publishing anything that is, quote, likely to expose a person or a group or a class of persons to hatred or contempt. Although violation of this act does not create a criminal record, it can embroil publishers and writers in fines and huge court costs. Doug Collins was a popular columnist for the BC North Shore News. He incurred several $100,000 in legal fees and a $2,000 fine, primarily because he questioned in print the accuracy of the 6 million figure of the Holocaust. The North Shore News is now forbidden to publish his work. Yet more powerful legal tools may soon be coming to the aid of provincial police. Police told me broader, stiffer legislation is imminently expected to come down from Ottawa. Such will greatly empower provincial police to prosecute persons charged with hate crimes. We should be aware that B'nai B'rith Canada and the Canadian Jewish Congress were never really satisfied with the federal hate statute, Section 319. Since it became law in 1971, they have pressured the government that it be toughened and expanded. In response, in 1995, the Attorney General of Ontario, in a speech to the Canadian Jewish Congress, reported that the Ontario provincial government is pressuring the federal government in Ottawa to, 1, make membership in hate organizations a crime, 2, expand what is considered an identifiable group under the law, and 3, eliminate the defense of truth for those charged with hate crimes. In an article in the Canadian Jewish News, B'nai B'rith Canada supports the Attorney General of Ontario and is reported as saying that not only should denial of the Holocaust become a crime, but hate mongers should no longer be allowed to use the defense of truth in court. What is this tough new legislation which police in Calgary and Vancouver are eagerly anticipating? The Police Hate Crimes Unit in Toronto gave me the answer.
Their spokesperson told me that at present no new legislation is actually before Parliament. However, in the last several years there has been a flurry of conferences and proposals on how to toughen Canada's anti-hate law. I was told that B'nai B'rith Canada has recently sponsored a very large international conference. Representatives from police hate units from all over Europe came to Canada. Their purpose was to assist B'nai B'rith in making Canada's anti-hate statutes as advanced as Europe's. This police representative said that police from Germany were prominent participants in the B'nai B'rith conference. You should be aware that in Germany, if anyone, including American citizens, are even overheard in private conversation, questioning the accuracy of the 6 million figure, they can be harshly fined and imprisoned. Yet this Toronto hate crime specialist told me B'nai B'rith is uneasy about taking Canada's hate law too far, too soon. Although B'nai B'rith is eager to protect homosexuals under Section 319, it fears a backlash which could actually repeal Canada's hate law altogether. This Toronto police authority also made several references to a proposal in late 1998 by Canada's 10 provincial attorney generals and the Canadian Solicitor General. This proposal would, 1. Criminalize all so-called hate literature that is meant for distribution. 2. Allow police to seize computer hard drives which contain alleged hate material. 3. Make truth no longer a defense for Holocaust revisionists. 4. Include homosexuals as a protected group under Section 319. Proposals such as this have not yet been placed before Parliament. Yet if they are, and are passed, police can immediately prosecute anyone who publicly criticizes the homosexual lifestyle or distributes literature that does. This means the collision of Canadian law and Christianity. While the true Christian never threatens physical harm to anyone, the Christian's duty is very much to alienate people, not only from homosexuality, but from abortion, pornography, witchcraft, child molestation, and so on. This means that if the Canadian Federal Code soon includes protection of homosexuality from criticism, public opposition to that identifiable group will become a hate crime. Anti-hate laws are thus anti-Christian laws. They are a demonically clever scheme to intimidate and eventually silence Christianity. One bright spot in Section 319 of the federal law has been the provision that if what the accused alleges is true, he cannot be found guilty of a verbal hate crime. Yet police in the anti-hate units of both Vancouver, BC and Calgary, Alberta, told me that for practical purposes they do not consider truth to be a defense for one charged with the crime of hurtful speech. Rather, police will do their best to prove in court that the person charged did intend to damage the feelings or reputations of members of an identifiable group. Proof of such intention to hurt means conviction. Truth does not matter.
With such a motivationally based justice system in place, Canada's new anti-hate tribunals have, during the last decade, lost little time in finding victims. Yet Canadian thought police did not begin by going after persons whom society would rally to support. Rather, they indicted those least in public favor. And who are they? Holocaust revisionists, those who question whether a full 6 million Jews were killed by Nazis during World War II. We should understand that virtually all Holocaust revisionists agree that Hitler hated, persecuted, and even killed many Jews. Yet revisionists usually put the numbers of Jews deliberately killed by the Nazis in the hundreds of thousands, not millions. They contend the evidence shows much greater numbers of Jews were killed as a result of war, famine, and epidemics in internment camps than as a result of deliberate murder. Yet the figure of 6 million is a virtual article of faith for B'nai B'rith Canada and the Canadian Jewish Congress. As a result, those organizations have relentlessly pressured the Canadian human rights tribunals to prosecute revisionists for publicly questioning the 6 million figure. Usually, revisionists have lost in court, and by losing, precedent has been established in Canadian law that questioning the 6 million figure is definitely a violation of Section 319, a hateful and hurtful act. With criminal convictions of those who doubt the 6 million figure comes chilling possibilities that Christians are also in violation of the federal code. Surely questioning numbers in the Holocaust is not as bad as describing another identifiable group, homosexuals, as evil and perverted. Yet that is exactly what the Bible instructs Christians to believe and teach concerning sodomy and those who practice it. As one of many biblical examples, Leviticus 18:22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination."
Are Christians, by their fundamental anti-gay stance, now in violation of Canada's anti-hate laws? I asked that question to the Federal Police Authority in Ottawa, Sergeant Murray Knowles. He told me that since homosexuals are not as yet included in Section 319's definition of a federally protected group, Christians can still criticize homosexuality. But I got a different story when I talked to the head of the anti-hate unit in Calgary, Alberta. He clearly considered anti-homosexual speech to be hateful and hurtful, and would do his best to see it prosecuted. If gays are not specifically protected under the federal law, how can such provincial police make anti-homosexual speech a hate crime? In British Columbia, the police anti-hate spokesperson told me that if someone were verbally humiliating homosexuals, the police would try first to convict that person on harassment charges. Once convicted, another federal statute, Section 718.2, passed by Ottawa in 1996, would kick in. It allows police to define such anti-gay harassment as a hate crime.
Section 718.2 makes intention to intimidate an aggravating circumstance, which boosts the penalty for such a biased crime. Section 718.2 also protects victims of bias-motivated crimes, such as homosexuals, under the full benefit of the federal hate law, Section 319.
These include stiffer fines and more jail time than if such harassment had not been motivated by a desire to humiliate.
One of the reasons it was so easy to make Holocaust revisionism a thought crime in Canada was because the feelings of a clearly identifiable group under Section 319, the Jews, were hurt. Yet there is much in the teachings of the New Testament which the Jews over the centuries have considered much more hurtful than denying the numbers of the Holocaust. For the past 2,000 years, most Jews have bitterly resented the charge that the Jewish nation killed Jesus Christ. This was called the anti-Semitic blood charge. Was it true? Listen to how in the book of Acts the apostles heaped blame upon that identifiable group, the people of Israel and their religious leaders.
Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. Therefore let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom ye crucified. But you disowned the holy and righteous one, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, but put to death the Prince of Life. By the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, whom ye crucified, this man stands before you in good health.
Such are only a few of the New Testament references indicting the Jewish nation and their leaders for the crucifixion.
It is largely because of such so-called anti-Semitism in the New Testament that Judaism has regarded literal New Testament Christianity as a breeding ground for hatred and persecution of Jews, hatred that eventually led to the Holocaust. One provision of the present Canadian hate law is that it allows people to criticize others out of sincere religious motives. Yet if a Canadian pastor, knowing full well the sensitivity of the Jews, teaches this biblical truth from the pulpit, he's in danger. There's no question he would be wide open to the charge of willfully inciting hatred. Under Section 319, he would not be able to defend his teaching as honest religious conviction. Rather, the Jews would argue, re-exposing their people to the blood charge, which led to the extinction of 6 million Jews, could only be viewed as a willful attempt to incite hatred. Such could lead to renewed persecution of an historically oppressed group. Christians in Canada know that simply questioning the extent of the Holocaust has earned Canadian revisionists huge fines, years of courtroom battles and appeals, a sentence of 1.5 years in prison, and even loss of Canadian citizenship. With that in mind, is any pastor in Canada going to preach with conviction what the New Testament teaches concerning the Jewish role in the crucifixion? To get the final answer, I again inquired of Sergeant Murray Knowles in Ottawa. He said that under Section 319, Christians do have the right to express sincere religious criticisms of other identifiable groups. Yet in reality, seeing how anti-hate law is presently evolving in the courts and taking into consideration the shadow cast by previous convictions, no Christian is likely to stick up his head and become the government's next test case. No one wants to help determine how far group libel laws can be stretched. I asked a Canadian Christian if believers in Canada are alarmed over such intimidation. When you live up here for a while, he said, you begin to sense when you are in danger of criticizing an identifiable group, and you back off. Everybody does. Otherwise, you know you are playing with fire. If someone complains, the police will come and you may be charged. Usually, trying to defend your case in court is much worse than just pleading guilty and paying a fine. In court, he said, you face financial and emotional exhaustion as you are dragged through the human rights tribunals. He said that in Canada, Christians, knowing the favoritism of the government towards such identifiable groups as homosexuals and Jews, do not come near any public criticism of their beliefs or behavior. As a result, Christians strictly obey the hate crime laws. That is why there are virtually no Christians being tried for violation of them. It is not that a moral dilemma does not exist. Rather, very few Christians are willing to court disaster by criticizing federally protected groups. Instead, they withdraw into the fellowship of their churches and into those aspects of religion that still remain politically safe.
Yet this is not the pattern Christ set for his Canadian disciples. Today, Christ would surely criticize identifiable groups, whether protected or not. Christ would be arrested in Canada as a hater. Christ would be dragged through the court system. Surely this fact alone illustrates how much freedom of conscience and expression the ADL has taken from Christians in Canada. An obvious solution to the problem of Christianity's violation of Canada's hate law is for Christianity to become something other than it has been throughout history. Christians might agree not to preach against sinners, especially as they gather in identifiable groups. Christians might never preach from any portions of Scripture that cast an unfavorable light upon homosexuals and Jews. But that would deny the faith. Christ said that if anyone removed even one word of Scripture from the Bible, even if it is considered homophobic or anti-Semitic, Christ would remove that person's name from his book of life. To no longer teach from or emphasize certain scriptures because they are controversial is to cut out these parts of the Bible as effectively as if scissors were actually taken to them. In the same way, if anyone is ashamed of publicly reading and teaching from any of the words of Jesus, Christ said he would be ashamed of that person in the day of judgment. It is obvious that Canadian Christians must now make up their minds whom they are going to obey. Canadian hate laws make it increasingly clear that it is now either God or the government. The chill from the north wind blowing through British Columbia today is mild compared to the chill on free speech that has settled on this beautiful province. Even now, preaching and witnessing, or proselytizing as it is called, is increasingly viewed by Canadian society as judgmental and intolerant. Ultimately, church organizations in Canada that allow such so-called intolerance may be declared illegal. Then all persons who are members of such illegal churches will be subject to persecution. If they persist in gathering together, they will be found in contempt of court, and imprisonment will follow. Eventually, the only fellowship Christians in Canada can enjoy may be tapping in code through their prison walls. As we near the conclusion of this video, we should remember that the ADL does not represent American ideals or have the best interests of the American or Canadian people at heart. If it did, pornographer Hugh Hefner would not have received the ADL's Freedom of the Press Award. The ADL is the unregistered, illegal representative of the interests and ambitions of a foreign power, Israel. ADL control, as Congressman Rarick testified, is greater than any federal agency. Political leaders do not hesitate to criticize the FBI and CIA if necessary, but no elected representative except Rarick has ever had the courage to expose the Jewish ADL before Congress. If they do so, they know the ADL will smear them as anti-Semitic and ruin their careers. Such power to silence all criticism is the very definition of absolute power. It is proof that the ADL's power is greater than the government's. Consequently, it is in vain to hope for any governmental restraint upon ADL power. Instead, it is up to each one of us to be suspicious of ADL propaganda and voice our objections to our elected representatives.
From what we have seen in this video, it should be clear that the secret purpose of the ADL is very different from what it conveys to an unsuspecting public. The ADL has not spied on Christians and Americans for 3/4 of a century in order to create a more tolerant world. Rather, the thousands of Americans who fill ADL files are persons the ADL wants eventually to criminalize. Communist revolutionaries such as Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Fidel Castro all gathered extensive lists of their political opponents long before they seized power. When power finally came, they used these lists to kill or imprison all opposition.
Yes, violent hate crimes do exist and should be vigorously prosecuted, especially at the state level. Yet contrary to ADL propaganda, violent crimes motivated by bias are relatively rare compared to violent crimes in general. The fact is, elimination of crimes of bias is not the ultimate purpose of the so-called anti-hate legislation now before Congress. Rather, as in Canada, this legislation intends to eventually create federal protection of certain special interest groups.
Now is the time to protest the next round of anti-hate legislation which the ADL, even now, is bringing before Congress. Inform your senators and congressmen that existing laws, adequately criminalize all forms of slander and violence. Anti-hate legislation could provide the foundation for a system of police-state spying and censorship. If the ADL requests are followed, it would ultimately allow Big Brother to determine which ideas are legal and which are not. Such probing into the motivational mindset of Americans is a very dangerous and far-reaching precedent. Once Congress gives the Justice Department, the FBI, and the ADL the right to criminalize our thoughts and words, our freedom will be over.
Because anti-hate laws are such an imminent threat to freedom, and because few Christians even know of the ADL, the National Prayer Network has prepared vital tools to inform you and your friends. The first is the video you have just watched, Hate Laws, Making Criminals of Christians. The second is Ted's 345-page book on the story of the Jews, past, present, and future, Israel, Our Duty, Our Dilemma. Distilling 15 years' research in little-known Jewish sources, Ted comes to much more biblical and realistic conclusions concerning present-day Israel than are commonly held in the church today. Finally, Ted's gripping one-hour video, The Other Israel, is the television version of his book. Fast-moving, yet thoroughly documented, The Other Israel discusses the extent of Jewish power and what should be the Christians' response to it. Hate Laws, Making Criminals of Christians is $24.90 post-paid. Israel, Our Duty, Our Dilemma is $15.95 post-paid. The Other Israel video is $22.95 post-paid. Canadian orders should be in U.S. funds with an additional $2.50 postage included for each item. Or buy all three for $55 post-paid, $60 in Canada. Order from National Prayer Network, P.O. Box 828, Clackamas, Oregon, 97015. Also, please visit our website at www.truthtellers.org.